Welcome to the 350th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I talk about disaster research and emergency management in the COVID era with disaster expert Dave NEAL. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. Today is a special COVID calls at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. And you can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle at US of Disaster or at COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please do feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. We are still booking guests into the fall with openings in November and December, and would love to hear from you if you have new research to share on COVID. So please do get in touch. Thank you. As of today, September 30th, 2021, there are 4,779,778 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is 16-year-old student dies after school ends mask mandate, citing declining cases. This was written by Ashton Pittman and appeared in the Mississippi Free Press September 29th, 2021. I want to also acknowledge the continuing really amazing work of the Facebook group Young and Severely Affected by COVID. Susan Scudda, who I had on as a guest a couple of weeks back, and also Cleavon MD. You can catch him on Twitter at Cleavon MD. They both are bringing forward a daily collection of obituaries and life stories that are well worth your time and should be read and shared. Landon Woodson had always been healthy until COVID, his mother insisted in a September 23rd Facebook post. But 2 days later, the North Pontotoc high school football player died of COVID-19 in a Memphis Children's Hospital after suffering cardiac arrest, she wrote. The Pontotoc County teen's death is one of two child COVID-19 fatalities the Mississippi State Department of Health reported September 29th. Another unidentified child between the ages of 11 and 17 also died. 10 days before Woodson's death, his school district, the Pontotoc County School District, announced that it would be ending its mask mandate on September 17th. The Pontotoc County School District began the year with no mask mandate in place on August 3rd. On August 17th, though, the district announced that despite preventative measures like disinfecting and recommending students wear masks and use hand sanitizer, quote, COVID-19 cases and quarantines have continued to rise at a fast pace, unquote. The district decided to enact a mask mandate beginning on August 18th. Requiring masks will not only potentially help reduce the transmission of COVID-19, but also help reduce the number of potential quarantines and athletic forfeitures, the district said in an August 17th letter. That same day, the district announced that North Pontotoc High School, where Landon Woodson attended, would go all virtual for 2 weeks from August 18th till September 1st due to an excessive number of students and staff who have quarantined or tested positive. But the Pontotoc School District is one of several districts that have dropped mask requirements in recent weeks as COVID-19 cases declined. When most schools reopened in August, the majority did not require masks. Most implemented mask mandates after a boom in cases at schools statewide in Mississippi quickly dwarfed the entire fall 2020 semester. Cases have since fallen from 5,763 students testing positive statewide during the week of August 16th to 1,084 last week. It's unclear when Woodson first became ill or where he contracted the virus, but a Facebook post by his mother indicates that an ambulance first arrived to transfer him to a hospital sometime around 3 a.m. on September 22nd. Please get vaccinated, Woodson's mother, Tracy Young, wrote on September 23rd, including a photo of her son in his football uniform and one of him on a ventilator in the hospital. On September 25th, she confirmed that her son had died. State Department of Health told the Mississippi Free Press that none of the Mississippians under 18 who have died of COVID-19 was vaccinated. There are no pediatric deaths in fully vaccinated individuals, Mississippi State epidemiologist Dr. Paul Byers said. Since mid August, when less than 15% of eligible Mississippi children were vaccinated, vaccination rates for children aged 12 to 17 have risen to over 30%, but there's a stark racial divide on child COVID-19 vaccinations. Health data shows that 38% of Black Mississippi children between the ages of 12 and 15 are fully vaccinated, while the same is true for only 21% of their white peers. Among those who are 16 or 17 years old, 39% of Black Mississippians are vaccinated compared to 25% of white Mississippians. Well, the two latest child deaths With the two latest child deaths, the total number of Mississippi children who've died of COVID-19 since the pandemic began has now tripled since July 25th. And 16-year-old Jenna Lynn Jensen of Picayune died due to complications from the virus. As schools reopened in August, Governor Tate Reeves said during an August 13th press conference that he had no intention to mandate masks in the schools this year, despite doing so last year. School mask mandates, he said, were no longer necessary because parents had since gained the option to vaccinate children aged 12 and older. At the time, though, less than 15% of eligible children were vaccinated. Reeves also downplayed concerns about safety for vaccine ineligible children under 12. Quote, if you look at those individuals under the age of 12, what you find is that it is very rare that kids under the age of 12 have anything other than the sniffles, unquote, the governor said on August 13th. Does it happen from time to time? Sure, it does, he said. I believe we have had one fatality of an individual. Maybe it could have been two. I think there's three under the age of 18 at this time. Mississippi State Health Officer Dr. Thomas Dobbs corrected him, holding up four fingers, four so far and one this summer, Dobbs said. The next day, though, that number rose to five when 13-year-old Michaela Robinson died just over a week after starting eighth grade at Raleigh Junior High School. Robinson, who was unvaccinated, had been in class and unaware of her illness as recently as 3 days before her death. In the month and a half since Governor Reeves downplayed the dangers of COVID-19 in children younger than 12, at least two of the Mississippi children who've died of COVID-19 were in the vaccine ineligible age group. The health department confirmed that one child who died in late August was between the ages of 1 and 5, while another who died earlier this month was a baby less than a year old. Before I bring on my guest, Dave Neal, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is episode 350 of COVID Calls. There are, according to Johns Hopkins, 696,717 deaths from COVID-19 in the United States today. I want to acknowledge the tireless work of the team, including Bucky Stanton, Shivani Patel, Hyuna Kume, and Eleanor Mays, and then over a dozen others who've worked really hard over the summer to prepare the transcripts and the other materials that are going into the COVID Calls website and archive. And that's going to be launching on October 15th. And I'll tell you a lot more about that next week. And we have special guests coming up throughout that entire week also. I'd also like to acknowledge my family for their constant support and toleration of me working on this project and their encouragement, frankly. One of the things that's happened to me lately is that dates and numbers generally are blurry. I'm looking more and more to the testimonies of healthcare workers and COVID survivors to make sense of what we're living through. In the narratives, I see the true outline of this disaster, and it's not something you can plot on a graph. I'm going to read just a short bit of a Twitter thread yesterday that a physician, Dr. Bakshi, posted. And you can follow her on Twitter at Nija Bakshi, and her name is Nija Bakshi. She's a physician, and her Twitter handle is at Nija B, at capital Neeja, capital B, at Nija B. You may see, I mean, this has become a genre, not a genre anybody would have maybe predicted or wanted, but a genre of physicians who are trying to, I think, shake the public into awareness and maybe drive up vaccination rates by explaining what's happening to them in the emergency department. I'm just going to read a bit of what she related on Twitter. Hi, Jane. This is Dr. Bakshi calling from Edmonton. I'm not sure if you're aware, but your mom, Anne, was admitted to the COVID ward about 2 hours ago. I'm calling because she's not doing well and will likely not survive the day. Deafening silence, followed by a chilling shriek, tears, gasping for air, trying to form words. Phone clicks. 5 minutes pass and I call again. Hi, Jane. I know that was a lot to take in. Through her tears, Jane responds, Yes, I'm so sorry for hanging up on you. I was shocked. I didn't even know she wasn't well. I spoke to my mom 2 days ago. I'm in BC. I won't make it in time, will I? I don't think so, Jane. I'm so sorry, Jane. Tell me about your mom. Jane takes a deep breath. Mom is a fierce and spunky 75-year-old with the spirit of a 30-year-old. She loves to dress to the nines and is always laughing and always told us she wanted to die on her own terms. As Jane begins sobbing again, Doc, there's really nothing you can do. Can I see her? What will I say to her? Is she awake? Jane, your mom is awake and as fierce as ever, but her oxygen saturations are down to 80% and we have her maximal oxygen. She does not wish to be placed on a ventilator, and this sounds consistent with what you've told me about mom. Would you like me to arrange a Zoom? Jane says, Yes, please. I need 10 minutes to get myself together. Do I have 10 minutes? Find the iPad, get it connected through a blurry screen, and don PPE. I go in to talk to Anne about her condition before I contact Jane. With the high flow oxygen plus a non-rebreather mask we have on Anne to give as much support as we can, I have to yell so she can hear me. Your oxygen is not good. Your lungs are tiring out. There is nothing more we can do. And with a giant deep breath, I yell, Anne, you're dying. Anne looks at me deep into my eyes and mouths, When? Today. The thread goes on, and I recommend people check it out. Dr. Nija Bakshi on Twitter at Nija B. That's the truth of what we're living and dying with in America and around the world today. And if we don't keep working to read, share, and tell these stories, then we will lapse into normalization. We will harden ourselves to loss and dream only of recovery, which is a fable as far as I'm concerned, instead of working to fix the structures that got us into this and keep us here. October 15th, we will launch the COVID Calls website and the research archive for COVID Calls. It's a small contribution, but I hope it's a meaningful one. So please stay with us. I hope these calls and the archive are helpful. And thank you always for your support of COVID Calls. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and this is one I've really been excited about. Let me introduce my guest, Dave NEAL. David M. NEAL, PhD, recently retired as Professor Emeritus in Fire and Emergency Management from Oklahoma State University. He's now a visiting scholar and affiliated scholar with Indiana University South Bend, and an affiliated researcher with the Risk and Crisis Research Center at Mid-Sweden University. Dave NEAL has a bachelor's and master's degree from Bowling Green State University, and he attended the Ohio State University, was a student in the Disaster Research Center in the 1980s, earning his PhD in 1985 in sociology. He has conducted disaster research since 1978. He taught his first disaster class in 1979. That's an auspicious year. He's also received funding for his research from the National Science Foundation, Department of Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the American National Red Cross, and the Alabama Consortium on Higher Education, among others. Academic publications can be found in many journals, and I recommend all of them. International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters, Natural Hazards, Journal of Emergency Management, to name just a few. He's taught in emergency and disaster management degree programs since 1989. And in 2015, he received the Blanchard Award for Excellence in Emergency Management Education. Dave, Neal, I'm just scratching the surface there. It's really good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And only now have I fully grasped how much of an effort this is every day. I mean, this is quite a production. Very impressive.
Thanks. I mean, I have a lot of people helping me out, and you know this too. I mean, we kind of rely on each other, disaster researchers, and the amount of talent out there is just really staggering. So it's always an honor to talk to folks, and particularly to you. So I want to get started. Maybe we can just start the way I generally do, find out where you're calling from and what it's looking like there, COVID wise.
Okay. I am currently in South Bend, Indiana, which is hanging in there with COVID right now. We're the county I'm in, St. Joe County, is probably a bit over 50% vaccinated, which isn't that good per se. But for Indiana, that's a pretty good number, and I think it's because we have at least four universities in the county. Of course, a lot of people are familiar with the University of Notre Dame. Of course, we have Indiana University South Bend, St. Mary's, which is part of Notre Dame. They are, but they aren't. Um, Holy Cross University. So we have a well educated group of people here. Some people may recognize the name Pete Buttigieg, which I could pronounce. Former mayor of South Bend, who's now the Secretary of Transportation in President Biden's cabinet. So a progressive city. You look at the counties around St. Joseph County, we're hitting vaccination rates probably around 33, 35, maybe 40%. So, yeah, the situation isn't that good, but I think here in South Bend, although people come in from outside, the rare times I go out, I feel relatively safe, although I've had two Pfizers. I'll be getting the booster soon. I always wear a
Mm.
mask. So that's the way we live these days.
What's the masking situation? Are you seeing it? People wearing a mask in the grocery store, or when you go out to restaurant for takeout, or whatever you do out in public?
Yeah, and for me, it's mostly the grocery store or a doctor's office. Of course, the doctor's
Mm.
office, you're always going to see it, or when I'm doing my physical therapy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And as the situation gets worse or better, we can see the number of masks being worn increases and decreases. So there is some intent behind there, but on the one hand, you do have a group of people. I'm estimating, that classic like 33% number that
Mm.
won't do it. So yeah, it could be better. It could be worse.
Let me follow up with you about your memories of this time, and I'm sure they're dense, but I wonder if you might pull one out for us. What this COVID era, something that really strikes you, your own personal memory of this time.
It was in my doctor's office just about a year ago, and he's aware of what I do, what I did professionally. So we were sort of talking about COVID a little bit from a disaster angle, and he mentioned that um, he had just started his private practice. He had a practice, and then he was also doing some work at the hospital, but he transitioned just to the practice. And he mentioned that so many of his doctor colleagues were having a difficult time dealing with all the death.
Mm.
And he said that he could deal with it a little bit better because the year between graduating from college and starting medical school, he worked in a forensics office, so he was dealing with dead bodies all the time. Now, obviously, he wasn't seeing them die, but he was dealing with death on a daily basis. Whereas his colleagues before COVID, they would deal with death. It's part of being a doctor. You get trained with that. It's still stress. But this just became overwhelming. I picked up on a similar theme. The first of the year, I did about 4 guest lectures for a interesting program, degree program done by Southern Methodist University and Baylor Medical College. So we had a combination of hospital administrators, nurses, physicians, fire chiefs, and that same theme, although cast differently, bubbled up. It's just this overwhelming notion of death. Now, we, the public standing outside, we read about it and maybe we know some people that have died, but to see this constant flow of death and coupled with that, the refrigerated trucks showing up, and we had them here in South Bend for a period of time because there was no extra place to put the bodies. So obviously, and we might touch upon this here in a little bit, COVID isn't just about all the deaths, which is enormous, but it is certainly having its impact on its own, a very direct, not subtle impact. But there are other more subtle things going on that I think a lot of us are missing out on. But it's hitting the medical community
Mhm.
really hard.
It sticks. You and I didn't coordinate this, but I mean, it sticks with
Yeah,
what I was reading before. The need Dr. Nijab Bakshi, and these have been coming. I for a long time I didn't see them. Maybe they were there. I can't read everything on Twitter. I can't read everything that's out there. But I feel like in the last 6 months we see a lot more of them. Nurses and doctors telling their story.
yeah,
And I don't know, people who are more expert in sort of the sociology of medical practice and healthcare workers will have to weigh in on this. I think there's just like with firefighters and police and other first responders, there's strong social pressure to keep it in personally, and also keep it in the room. But then it's escaped that now, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
What did you say to your doctor? I mean, if he confided that in you, given your experience, were you able to pull something out of the disaster research bag to help him?
Uh, I was sort of first astounded he even said that,
Yeah, yeah.
and I didn't quite know what to say, but I did tell him that obviously the topic's a difficult topic, and I told him about the research that I did with Brenda Phillips and Tom Weichel right after the Indian Ocean tsunami, where our research question was, what do you do with 8,000 dead bodies?
Mm,
Actually, there are 16,000 dead, but 8,000 were never recovered. And how how the people gathered the bodies up and logically buried the bodies. They had like 90% of the dead identified fairly rapidly. So they know where almost every person is who was buried in the 3 mass graves. But, that's just the surface of that. So I didn't know what else to say. So that was sort of the story
mhm.
that I told them. Yeah, mass death is a tough thing to deal with. And we saw that in India, although that wasn't, ours was the bodies rather than the afterwards parts. And, that's one of the things about doing disaster research, however you want to define that, and that's casting a rather broad net. There's a lot we know and a lot we don't know. And that latter has implications theoretically for the pure academic types and for those who are uh, professionals, practitioners, and those that are bridging
Mm,
the gap. What do we do with this knowledge? And it's clear from, I think, extrapolating our research and looking at what happened at 9/11. Uh, we as a nation aren't very good at dealing with mass death. I think
mm,
probably 9/11 points that out better. India managed it quite well, at least bureaucratically. There will be
mm,
some people that would probably disagree with that. But when you have 8,000 bodies buried and 90% of them identified within 4 or 5 days after the tsunami, I think that's why National Science Foundation and others were interested is can we learn anything from this?
mm, mhm, mhm.
There's learning and then there's applying. So,
So, it's uncanny, I think, for many of us when we have a sort of research heroes and then we find them on social media. And I remember, following you on Twitter, and I always enjoy you on Twitter because, um, well, for lots of reasons, but one is that oftentimes somebody will be say opining about something, and you come in with something and say, "By the way, Corntelli 86," or just subtle reminders that there's also a nice base of research out there that we should continue to keep at hand. And I think you do it in a nice way, but I think it's a good reminder. And as a historian, of course, I love that. And then you went silent for a while.
Oh, yeah.
And then it became, I can't remember how you broke the silence, but you told us all that you'd had Guillain-Barre syndrome
Mhm.
through all of this, through this whole COVID thing, and that were in bad shape.
Yes, I was.
Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, Guillain-Barre is an autoimmune disease, and there's a lot we don't know about it. It's a rare disease. One out of every 100,000 people come down with it annually. So that in the United States, maybe 3,500 people a year, plus or minus or whatever. Out of that, 30% of those who get Guillain-Barre have to be put on a ventilator. I wasn't, but still, those are pretty good odds. And 10% of the people who get it die, primarily because of the breathing issues. What happens is a virus of some type triggers the autoimmune system and it goes into overdrive. Now, remember, I'm a sociologist, not a medical person for those listening. And in response to this virus, it begins destroying the sheath, the myelin sheath around the nerves. When that happens, the brain cannot send messages all the way to the nerves to tell the muscles what to do, or the muscles then relay the message back up to the brain. So, in essence, um, I first had symptoms middle or early part of September. Within a week, I was in the emergency room. In fact, it was, and I'm not superstitious at all. I could hear Neil deGrasse Tyson chuckling about this, but it was Friday the 13th during a full moon. It's when I was admitted to the emergency room. So I had nothing to do with it. But I couldn't walk. I couldn't feel my feet, my legs. I couldn't, and then it started hitting my arms. I could feel it moving up my body. And if it hits the diaphragm, that's where you have to go on the ventilator. But it didn't get that bad. I had all kinds of issues, swallowing problems, messages to the heart were getting messed up. So I had some various heart issues they had to take care of. So, yeah, it was, I was in the hospital for 6 weeks, um, 10 days in the cardiac unit because they were trying to get everything squared around there. Then I was moved to rehab where I spent the first week just trying to learn to move a toe. I mean,
Mm.
and the goal for 6 weeks was to have me be able to go from my bed to a wheelchair with one person helping me. There was a lift that was used to pull me out of the bed onto the wheelchair so I could go down and do my rehab 3 hours in the morning, I think it was, and 3 hours in the afternoon. I finally, like 3 or 4 months after going to the hospital, I really didn't need to use the wheelchair that much. I transitioned to a walker. And then from the walker, I was able to transition to a cane. And by the end of February, I was getting around fairly well, usually with a cane, sometimes a walker. And I was allowed to drive. I had to go through all kinds of stuff to be able to drive again to make sure I was cognitively in good shape and physically my reflexes were okay. So I was able to get out and about, which was really nice. And then COVID hit. So I had to stop my physical therapy because obviously I didn't want to go back in and expose myself. And so basically, I retired the end of 2018. I had 9 months of retirement here at home and then I had Guillain-Barre, and then COVID. So that's been my existence for almost 3.5, 4 years. Um, one of the There's something called residuals in the Guillain-Barre world, which are after effects of the illness. And some of these will sound familiar with something else, as you'll find out in a minute. But one is brain fog. Um, Sometimes I'll be talking, or say I'm talking something academically, and I will forget a citation. Now, who was it that wrote on Panic in 1954 that said it really didn't exist? I mean, stuff as simple as that.
Right.
Oh, it's Gordon Telly. Okay. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's stuff like that, or more real life. I come in the living room, my wife said, "Could you get me a glass of wine?" And I said, "Sure." And I do two things. And then I just walk away forgetting the glass of wine. Although she would say that's my normal behavior.
Right.
The, my walking, I got to the point where I can move around. Now my physical therapy is about walking normally. I mean, there's walking and then there's walking. So it takes sometimes at least 3 years to recover. Probably the most weird part of it, and I've really had to adjust my my work schedule. Yeah, I'm retired, but there's things I want to do, and that's the extreme fatigue. When I first got out of the hospital, and if I took a shower at home, I would need a 2-hour nap afterwards. That just
Mm.
went without saying. The days that I have physical therapy now, um, I usually take a 2.5-hour nap. Sometimes therapy is usually in the morning, so I'll take it late morning. And even in the evening, I used to do some work in the evening and even emails, and that's why I get behind sometimes. I just don't have the mental energy
Mm.
to sit down and think, say, okay, I'm going to write an email, let alone any other type of creative work. So that's still been a struggle, but I'm slowly dealing with it. So that's interesting too, is that some of the residuals that that you have with Guillain-Barre are similar to the symptoms or the aftermath the long haulers have in COVID,
Right.
which is the brain fog, the fatigue. There are a lot of people with Guillain-Barre that have the extreme joint fatigue afterwards.
Mhm.
I don't have that, but there's some interesting parallels there, as there is, and I don't know if you've seen me get into this on Twitter. See, I almost forgot what Twitter was. That was, but it's more probably on Facebook because I belong to a Guillain-Barre group. But
Mm.
the anti-vax
Mm.
stuff is big in both. You know, big data sets suggest that during the fall, when people are getting flu shots, there might be 2 cases per 200,000 people getting Guillain-Barre rather than one. So that may suggest that the flu shots very rarely will cause Guillain-Barre.
Mhm.
So, there's lots of controversy about, will the COVID shots cause Guillain-Barre, and people are all excited because they said, "Look, 1 out of 100,000 cases, you're going to get Guillain-Barre," and I put, "Well, that's what it is normally." I mean, it's
Right.
not even a correlation
Right.
nor causation. It's just so no, nothing's there, and in fact, the flip is what the concern is that COVID can set off um, Guillain-Barre and
Right.
put the immune system in overdrive, not the vax, but the disease
But the
itself.
disease.
And that confuses a lot of people also. So you see in both you see in the Guillain-Barre world concerns about the flu vaccination and of course the um, the COVID vax. And I talked with my physician about this back in even last fall when we knew they were probably going to be coming up. whether I should take it or not. And initially, I was a little hesitant just to see the data, but as soon as I could get mine, I got mine. So, yeah, some
Well,
interesting parallels there.
I'm glad you're okay,
Thank you.
and I'm sorry you went through all that. And I guess I wonder also too. I mean, you're right. I mean, those parallels to what people describe long COVID is like are startling and real. And I guess just one sort of follow up question on that is when you once COVID started. So you have a really unique vantage point on this because you're in the health system, and then the pandemic is coming. Did you I mean, have you noticed a difference? I mean, in terms of your access to care or the stress that the teams are under or just using facilities? I wonder what that looked like.
The one access to care I had, and it wasn't directly linked with Guillain-Barre, um, but I kept on getting these mild chest infections, and it's from asthma I have. So, I would call, make the appointment, and then they would ask me these questions. Well, since I have a chest infection, it sounds like COVID. So every time I go see the doctor, I'm not going into the main office. I'm going to their COVID test area
Right.
where they test me for COVID. And that became the prime reason for the trip. And the doctor really, and it wasn't his fault, it's the system. As a sociologist, I see the system. He could not do what he really wanted to do, although the test turned out to be negative.
Right. Because you're
We,
in the COVID shoot.
yeah, so we were sort of treating things at
Yeah.
the surface level until um, he and I, we figured out what was going on. So we were able to get me into his main office by June to deal with the other issue. Um, and I think, obviously there are people going into the medical facilities, both when I go into physical therapy and doctor's office, who aren't pleased with wearing masks or let their nose hang out, which I find very
Mm.
irritating and rude. But yeah, that's a whole other set of issues. Yeah, the access was just a little more difficult because everything is being pushed
Right.
toward something else.
Right. Well, I have a lot of questions for you about research, but I'd like to take it back and maybe just ask you kind of a basic question why you got interested in disaster research in the first place, and maybe talk a bit about what it was like to be a student at the Disaster Research Center at a really critical time because it was making that transition from Ohio
Yeah.
to Delaware. And I guess start anywhere you like, but I'm curious to know kind of what got you into this, and then what was that environment like when you jumped in there with Dines and Corntelli and the other researchers who were really, I guess you could say, at their peak of productivity right around that time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, the interest really academically became kindled when I took a class in collective behavior under Joe Perry at Bowling Green State University my junior year in college, and part of the curriculum, and it was also in the textbook we had, was about disasters. And of course, there's a theoretical connection between collective behavior, disasters, emergent norm theory, and that caught my fancy. And also at the time, Joe and a colleague of his, Med Pugh, were writing a collective behavior textbook. So I volunteered to read a draft from the student's perspective, and that just and I became more and more interested in sociology. So then I did my master's at Bowling Green under Joe, and it was on the blizzard of '77 and how people got the messages and how did they prepare for this blizzard coming on. And although we all believe firmly in the all hazards approach, there's not much research on blizzards even today. I mean, it's just, and blizzards are different than a lot of other hazards and disasters because basically when the snow's done, hardly anything's destroyed except maybe energy, power. I mean, it's just weird like that. So after I graduated from Bowling Green, I taught for 3 years at two small universities, University of Evansville and then University of Montevallo in Alabama. Then I started at Disaster Research Center September 1981, 40 years ago. And Dines at that time had left DRC a couple years earlier to become the secretary of the American Sociological Association, which in essence, that position is that you were the lobbyist for the organization representing all sociologists in Washington, D.C. Um, Although, later on I got to know Russ really well, part of the family, and also, as you well know, with Russ, there's something like sitting down with a little bit of scotch or something and just letting Russ tell stories. I mean, that's always worth the price of admission wherever you're at. So DRC was sort of in a time of transition. Only Henry was the only faculty member involved at that time, and there were 6 of us employed, primarily working on the Emergent Citizen Group in Disasters project, which there had been other research sort of dealing with this in the past, but this is a large-scale, nationwide NSF-supported study about the hows and whys of neighborhood groups forming before or after hazards or disasters. And a number of neighborhoods did this. And to sort of segue off a little bit, and I'll come right back, we might explore this later on. I think in some ways, in retrospect, this is where the germ of the idea came that the disaster phases are okay, but they aren't reality. Because you could see a group working on preparedness and mitigation at the same time. Well, or mitigation and recovery at the same time. And it just gets all confusing. So in addition to that, there was a contract with FEMA, a continuation of a contract to just look at emergency response issues, specifically emergent groups in disaster. So to sort of summarize from my time there, 81 to the end of 84, the notion of emergence, new groups or organizations that form before, during, or after disasters was probably the driving force behind a lot of what was going on at the center. Although at that time, Quarantelli, I think by 82, he knew he was going to retire soon because because of his age and cashing in some of his military experience, he, of course, to say that Quarantelli retired is very much of a misnomer because he moved to Delaware and although he wasn't director of DRC, he was still cranking good stuff out. So there are 2 things that I found really interesting about that time period that I was sort of in the middle of. Well, there were a lot, but one was that I remember when word got out, Henry was thinking about moving DRC either to Delaware or to University of Denver, where Draybeck was.
Right.
I remember being at a regional meeting I think it was Kansas City. Maybe it's the Midwest meetings, and I was presenting along with Tom Draybeck, Gary Krebs, and one other known DRC alum who my brain fog was interfering with. So that was a little overwhelming to begin with. But then I get see a message up on the board about 10 minutes before I go to the meeting from Draybeck saying, "How would you like to have lunch?" Which was just sounded really foreboding. Although Tom's a great person, a nice person.
Yeah.
What Tom wanted basically during our lunch was the gossip on where Henry was leaning toward and what was going on. So Tom could make his pitch to get the center to Delaware. Eventually, of course, Henry made his decision, and it just made a lot of sense. And sort of one part, well, first of all, Delaware is real close to New York City. He grew up in Little Italy, so sort of close to home, and he always kept those New York connections. Winger was there, and of course, Dines was there. I always see like Dines and Quarantelli, sort of like Lennon and McCartney and Jaggers and Richards. There's just, and one maybe contributes a lot to one thing, one to another, but their names are together like that. So it just made a lot of sense for Henry to move that to Delaware. And then this was probably 3 or 4 months before the move. The decision had been made, and I was in his office probably talking about, to a certain degree, getting my dissertation done. And all of a sudden, it wasn't normal for him to do this. He sort of went into, Kaufman backstage behavior. But he said, I can't wait for the move. He says, if the air conditioner doesn't work, Winger's going to have to take care of it. If I have to fire a graduate student, Winger's going to have to take care of it. If there's a mouse in the place, Winger's going to have to take care of it. Basically, he was tired of being an administrator and just wanted to do his research. Fully understood that. So,
So and that move was accomplished. And I mean, just what you said, he was so-called retired, but I interviewed him in the 2000s. Um, and I like your metaphor of the Lennon and McCartney. I'm trying to figure out which is which. I would suppose Corntelli is more the Lennon and Dines is more the McCartney. I have to think about that a little bit more. Um, Corntelli was very kind, but also when I interviewed him, I asked a few questions that didn't measure up, and he just said, "I'm not. That's not an interesting question." And I thought that was great because it saved time for both of us. We move on to the next thing. Whereas Dines, just as you said, we sort of sat down, had multiple long interviews with him, and he just embraced my project and was so encouraging to young scholars. And Corntelli was too, but in a different way.
yeah,
But I got to know Dines a little bit, and then every time I'd come down to visit there, he would have a stack of stuff for me. Just here's some stuff. I thought about a question you asked. I barely knew the guy. I wasn't his student, and just that generosity, but also I think strategic generosity too. I don't mean that cynically. Like they
right.
wanted to get the word out about this body of work, and I have drawn on their inspiration with COVID calls. Like
Yep,
there's so much research out there. It can be esoteric at times. It should be, and then we have to sort of struggle to find these plateaus or median spaces where we can kind of pass things to each other and then pass them outside the community to others who can use them. And that's ongoing work. And I think that has defined a lot of what I really respect about your career is that you always had that interest in theory, but then translation. And I want to sort of follow up on that. How did you get that interest? What stoked that? And I guess another way to ask it is, you know, what made you want to teach not only in sociology but also in emergency management? Because I think you could do disaster sociology and then tuck into a sociology department and do critical theory and be fine. And there's a lot of researchers who do that and they write great things. That's not really been your trajectory, has it?
no, and some of it is just where the social forces took me. Um, it just, I see. Originally, I wanted to study crowds and riots, and I published a little bit on that. Although there's obviously some connections with disasters, and the position at North Texas opened up in 1989. I had been at Oak Ridge National Lab for 3 years, which was an interesting experience, very educational experience for me in many ways. Things I learned that I could take into the academic arena. So North Texas was starting. Well, they actually had the very first bachelor's degree in emergency management. Started in 1982. They had someone on loan from FEMA and some other people, and it just wasn't working out. And also, they wanted money. They wanted, everyone wants the research money to come in. So they hired two people who were practitioner types, Tom Johnson, who'd worked with FEMA, and Bob Reed, who really wasn't a disaster person, but retired Air Force colonel who had very good connections with the administration. That's, and they needed a disaster researcher, and they didn't want to pay the price of a full professor, so they hired an assistant professor. So I had a dual tenure line, I guess you would say. I was in both sociology and the emergency management program. I wouldn't recommend that for junior faculty members these days. You have two different masters to answer to. But that gave me an opportunity to do sociology and to teach collective behavior at the graduate level, because the sociology department had a PhD program, and to do disasters and to teach disasters. So it was the best of both worlds. And it also became very clear, and one thing that we promoted, and again, this is a first degree program, is that what we do needs to be evidence based. There's a lot of people out there that are even today that are teaching emergency management who are telling stories, what I call I was there Bubba stories. Now, those are nice. And I have my own set of stories, but I like to tell a story that's grounded in the research or to show why the research is as it is. And this story illustrates it.
Mm.
And we get a lot of misinformation because of that. And I think one of the contributions that my colleagues and I made, and there's a certain irony here, is you know, we were making it up as we went. And by 91, we said, we need to have a real curriculum because the curriculum that had been put together before us was a hodgepodge of stuff that was based upon certain people's interests rather than what are the needs of emergency management. So the first question was, what are we going to hang our hat on? What is emergency management? And it was my colleague Tom Jocelyn who I think first suggested, and this really led to a good discussion. Let's use the four phases of disaster, which I thought was brilliant. I still think it was brilliant. So you teach an intro class, you have your introduction, history of the field, and then you have the four phases. And then you put on the end, might be international stuff, might be X, might be Y, make it to whatever you like. And then that sets the foundation for the rest of your curriculum where you have a class on preparedness, one on response, one on recovery, one on mitigation. And we had some other classes that we then integrated. And I think a lot of programs today copied that model, stole it, borrowed it, I don't know what you say, not knowing where it came from and how it got established. Although I think it's still a useful approach, but gosh, almost 40 years, it's time to find another way to present that information. That's not my job. I already did that once. The next generation can figure that out. But it still works in a general way for devising curriculum.
Hmm.
And that's something that, well, with all the programs I help get started in various ways, that's one of the things I'm more proud of, but a lot of people really don't know about is my role at North Texas doing that, or at Jacksonville State with the first two totally online programs. And that not only means the disaster programs, but getting things set up undergraduate degree with all your gen ed requirements and trying to get that online. The graduate course was a little easier because it just involves us. So I think the coffee has hit right now, and I'm not sure I was going with the
Yeah, no, we were, I think it's
question.
yeah. Well, this desire to integrate, and you wrote about it in 90. I mean, you wrote about it several times, but you wrote about it in one case in 1993 for the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters, and talking about this really pressing need to integrate theory and practice. And I'm glad you talked about the curriculum and the four disaster stages: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, as a way to think about a curriculum, because what strikes me as particularly ingenious about that is that it takes concepts which are useful in the world of practice, emergency management
Right.
practice, which itself people should know. I mean, incident management system and those kinds of things, they were all in flux in that time too. I mean, these were, the 70s to the 90s were periods of time of enormous change in what we now sort of say emergency management seems like a settled matter. Not at all in those years. But then you bring them back into the world of theory, so that there's this constant traffic back and forth from the applied, like this gets turned into a manual that people have to like learn and train on by law. And if they mess it up, they got to go to Congress and answer for their mistakes. And then you come to the other side and talk about what does it mean to talk about time in disasters? And are these stages? I mean, you're very reflexive about that in your work. We can use them, but we also need to have a reflexivity and a critical stance towards them. And so that's what I wanted to hear more about from you as well. I mean, I think how you negotiated that. I mean, it's a standard thing we hear. We wish there was more theory in emergency management, and then we hear from the other side, we wish there was more pragmatism in disaster research. Maybe that's just family feuds that will never end. Although I think you made some headway there, frankly.
And the solution to that now, and again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we can come back to some of this other, but it's still connected. The third edition of our textbook, the title has changed. And it reflects just that, I think, to a degree. You know, the first two editions were Introduction to Emergency Management. But we've been looking out and being part of the field. Well, Brenda Phillips, who's also my wife, self-disclosure for those out there that don't know, Gary Webb, and myself. Let me just a little bit of trivia about Gary and me. Gary's from Texas. I was his thesis advisor, as it turns out, at North Texas. And then he went to DRC, and his dissertation advisor was Russell Dines. So Gary and I were Henry's and Russ's last PhD students. Now that's really digging deep for trivia, but so there's another weird connection with Joe Perry I won't even go to, but there's this Texas thing going on with all that. So, we would get on Zoom, and as we're getting ready to try to get the third edition together, and we decided for a number of reasons to change the title to Introduction to Emergency Management and Disaster Science, which in part, I think, sort of reflects some of the issues you just brought up there. But okay, there's a certain body of knowledge that the professionals, practitioners need to know and need to use. But on the other hand, there is the science. And sometimes those are, two different things going in two different directions, two different purposes. Maybe down the road, there'll be two different books for that. One more for the sociology, geography, public administration classes, one for the emergency management degree classes. That's for the future generation to decide. But and first of all, the usage of the word disaster, I think, is really important. A lot of times we don't distinguish between these events very well, and the word emergency gets overused. And emergency management for a large scale event, well, that's not an emergency. So you're already giving the wrong impression by the usage of that word. In fact, in the textbook, I think I wrote this section where in the most simple form, you have everyday life where these little emergencies, heart attacks come up. It's also in the social time article. Then you have disasters, and then you have the catastrophes.
Mm.
There's different levels and all kinds of different things going on, but that's for down the road. The other thing about the textbook we had to keep in mind was it's a survey course. We're a survey course, and you can't dive too deeply. And that was probably one of my problems when I was writing, because I was thinking, oh my God, I wrote this journal sentence. What if one of my colleagues sees this and said, well, that's true, but what about A, B, C, D, E, and F? And then we'd have to step back and say, well, that's not the purpose of this textbook. We can do that some other time. So we'll continue to struggle. I've had a lot of students who are especially PhD students from Oklahoma State who are former emergency management, fire chiefs, police officers, and so forth. And it's like, okay, they went through the process, they learned the research, but did they really learn it to use it? You know, or we're just going to go back to our old-fashioned way. So that battle's going to continue. That what knowledge don't mean nothing. It's your experience.
Hmm.
Now, one way I used to argue against that in class, you almost alluded to it, is um, if you make a mistake and you're sued, I'll say I'm not a lawyer, but if you make a mistake and if you're sued, if you can say you used the best evidence based on science for your decision rather than what Bubba told you, you're probably going to be okay in the lawsuit. But if you say, well, Bubba told me to do it, you probably
That
aren't.
doesn't stand up.
Yeah.
But I want to come back to the time issue for a second, because with COVID, it's been, and maybe bring COVID into this a little bit. Describing, I thought something you just said was really important. So, in I guess April of 2020, Federal Emergency Management Agency of the United States becomes the lead organization for the response. Health and Human Services was fired. FEMA was hired. I'm simplifying. Um, and I think it may be in April of 2020 that word emergency might have made more sense to what we were looking at with COVID. Um, but even that word, as you said, is problematic as we start to think about time. And COVID's a weird one because it's it's way longer and way more impactful than a disaster event that we might think is a bit more localized and a bit more punctuated in time. But it's not climate change. I mean, I'm hoping it becomes endemic within a reasonable amount of time. God, I'm really hopeful of that. And so maybe we're looking at a 4-year span here. That's what I've been reading lately. And so the disaster phases, the stages as received, don't seem to account for the way time is playing out. And then, so I just want to point to this article you wrote in 1997, but it's been a theme throughout a lot of your work, and it was reconsidering the phases of disaster. And you introduce this correction. You say, we can talk about the clock, we can talk about the calendar, and that's useful. But we also have to think about time as a social negotiation. And that for me, I remember I remember where I was when I first read this article, and I was like, okay. And so there's the source of conflict, that you have to have a bureaucratization and an administrative state to deal with something that is a management function in terms of disaster. But we're also dealing with human beings and organizations, and that means it's society. And finding ways to translate one to the other and learn one to the other and work together is so crucial. I think and COVID has shown everything that can go wrong with that, I think, frankly. So I want to draw you out on all of that.
Um, First of all, and obviously I've been thinking about this. One of the things I like to do now that I say semi-retired is at night go out on the back porch, look at the stars, and have a little bit of scotch or drambuie or something like that. Just one or two fingers and mull these things over. I'm almost thinking, well, the phases don't work at all for COVID, and part of the reason why is that, okay, let's say it's back in March, April, May, we're in response. And then things drop off. Are we preparing? Are we trying to mitigate? But then another wave comes up. And it's these waves that keep on jolting us back to response. You think about, again, with the refrigerated trucks and reconfiguring the hospitals. How many times are hospitals having to do that to go back in response mode when the wave gets really high in their area? The other thing about COVID, and I use Charles Fritz's definition of disaster, although it's almost as old as I am. But basically, a situation located in time and space. So he captures the time element. You think about COVID when are having 2,000, 3,000 people dying a day. Well, that's scattered throughout the United States. It's having impacts. But imagine if those deaths were in one city at the same time, such as a 9/11. That would have a greater impact. So, we see close to 700,000 deaths now, but we can't quite conceptualize that because it's not a 9/11. But it's happening in the same time, but it washes away. So, right now, and it depends on our geographical location, perhaps, are we really back in response? Are we in preparedness? Are the COVID boosters from Pfizer, is that mitigation or is that preparedness? I used to joke in class to make the conceptual problem with preparedness and mitigation. It looks like it's going to rain. You grab an umbrella. Is that preparedness? Is that mitigation? Well, that can lead to a 50-minute discussion,
Mhm.
people getting pretty upset about that. Well, that's the same thing with the shots. Where are we with this? I don't know. So that again says we need to, I think, recast some of our ideas about what we go through. My pulmonologist asked me really an intriguing question 2 months ago with this, and it was basically, can we continue to sustain this for another year or two? Or is this going to be our new normal, what they're doing on emergency every day? Yeah, so the question is, how long can we maintain? I'll use the four-phase terminology. How long can we stay in response?
Right, right.
It's sort of like these restaurant shows, like Bar Rescue with Jake Taffer. I don't know if you saw that at all before you left, but uh, there's a bar. It's going under business. They bring in a bunch of people, and as customers, it gets overwhelmed, and everything just crashes. Well, our medical system is under a stress test, and it is starting to crash. We've seen stories of nurses now leaving their jobs,
Mhm.
of physicians, mental health issues coming up. So, yeah, this is beyond me right now, but how can we reconceptualize how we look at COVID
Yeah.
in terms of phases or life cycle or whatever you want to call it? It worked okay before, just okay, but it's certainly not working for this mess.
I think it's such a valuable insight and contribution in it, and it's not this is not academic. I mean, it may be discussed by academics, but I mean the kinds of discussion you're having right now, the kinds of issues you're raising, that boils down in the end to dollars spent on training in what areas, equipment. I mean, think about that early phase of the pandemic in which we're talking in the United States very seriously about whether or not we can have, respiratory equipment
Yeah,
or can we even surge PPE? And that exposes the kinds of commitments that federal government and state level agencies have already made to which parts of a disaster they can cope with. And so this matters in the way that budgets get written and the way that trainings work. And I guess I wonder, a follow-up question to you as a person who has done a lot of education with FEMA, uh, as a teacher, what do you foresee now or coming in the next couple of years? I mean, how will FEMA or state level emergency management agencies, how will they learn from this disaster?
we won't. I in my view, we just see the same thing over and over again. For example, look at Hurricane Ida. Have we really learned, and I'll use a four-phase term, have we really learned about recovery, when you look back at Katrina. No, that's true. I mean, people are tweaking, they're making improvements. The people that work for FEMA are doing their best, but the broader picture, and here's my sociology background, there's organizational inertia. Organizations just aren't going to change. And again, I think uh, the whole issue of FEMA being under DHS has just exacerbated all of this. I mean, that's worth a 2-hour discussion right there. Um, yeah, I mean, we know at one level, we know academically, we know professionally, bureaucracies don't work in time of crisis. That's settled. We know that, but yet we continue to insist upon these rigid bureaucracies to manage these events. One of the things I will give hospitals a lot of credit for, and I don't know if this is for every hospital, and this would probably be a topic I would be interested in trying to get some money for in research if I weren't retired, is the way hospitals adapted, became very flexible to deal with the surge of COVID. I mean, it really fits the definition of emergent organization where they totally changed their structure, they totally changed their process of doing things, and set up something that would work because it's not day to day business. And that's the whole issue. If you're in a new situation, your organization has to change or it's going to fail. Hospitals changed. They adapted the best they could with the resources they had. And theoretically, I find that interesting. And it goes right back to Russ and Henry's early work on emergence. It's still valid today.
Mhm.
Um, Same thing I learned with hospitals with convergence and people coming by, dropping off plastic bags since they didn't have PPEs or
Yeah.
food or anything like that. That goes right back to Fritz's work. And yeah, that's why you see some of the frustration of me on Twitter at times is that, gosh, people don't panic when there's a disaster warning. Yeah, we've
We
known
know that.
that.
Yeah.
Let's use that and move on to the next steps.
Mhm.
So, so much of what happens in a disaster before, during, and afterwards. And notice I've been using before, during, and afterwards a lot rather than the different phases.
Mhm.
Is predictable. I mean, to a certain degree, you can script out what's going to happen in these types of events. That's that's just the way it is.
But in this case with COVID, and you made that clarification of sort of emergency, disaster, and
Yeah.
catastrophe, and then you made it more complicated rather than less, which I appreciate. In that different places around the world, or let's just talk about the United States, are experiencing one aspect of that or another at different times.
Yep.
So I'm rolling down the street and I see emergency in my community. I look at the state level statistics and it's disaster, and then I turn on the news and I see nationally it's catastrophe and globally it's catastrophe. Um, but I mean, the scale of this is really, well, let me put it this way. Throughout my career, there's been this discussion or this sort of assumption, like the big one will come and that will change things. And September 11 wasn't it. Well, it was to a certain degree. I mean, the federal government changed a bit, I think, in ways that ultimately were not helpful to where we are today. That's my view. Katrina, okay, that's the big one, and everybody was waiting. I don't see how you get any bigger than this. And so I hear your pessimism about learning from this, and it's hard for me to cope with, frankly. As a person who's committed,
Yeah.
as you are, to learning things from disasters, I just feel like we have to come up with new tools for that learning. And if that means getting people out there banging on doors or creating new educational forms or working in the communities, I don't know where to start with it, Dave. I guess that's my point. And I sense your futility and I feel it too, but I want to push back on it somehow.
Well, I do think the degree programs have helped because you do have people in positions of leadership who know the science. They can predict what's going to happen, but their messages get watered down as things go out or they try to work through their bureaucracy. Just like you're still going to have the sheriff, no matter what county you're in, wanting to call the National Guard to shoot them looters. I mean, that's I used to say as a joke in class. I said, "Let the looters come," because have you ever been to a disaster site? And then I show slides. What is there left to loot? And we know one of the larger problems in many disasters is what do you do with the debris management? Well, if you have the looters come in and loot the debris, you have your problem solved. Of course, that's all tongue in cheek, but it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a certain degree of pessimism here. But I think this anti science ideology we are experiencing right now is making it worse.
Hmm.
And the ironies involved with that. And then going back to our textbook, I think that's one of the things we're promoting with the textbook is that it is science based, evidence based, and we are integrating ideas of climate change, resiliency. Although, like many others, I think personally, resiliency is a fad.
Yeah.
It's new, and what is it? But yet, it's the word of the decade still. So as educators, it's important we educate the students as to what's going on right now, even though it will eventually disappear. So yeah, we just have to keep on plugging away, and there's ebbs and flows of how important science is to all this. And but the big picture is, in my view, a lot of this is just baked into the system.
Hmm.
And one issue I really haven't touched upon, but it plays such a large role, and it's probably the third underlying theme in our textbook, is vulnerability, social vulnerability. And that was again where you see the time factor comes in. Um, who moves more quickly through response and recovery? The wealthy.
Right.
And the other groups associated with the wealth. Who moves through the slowest? Ethnic minorities, the poor, women, et cetera, et cetera. So when someone says, "Well, when does the recovery period start, or when is the event over?" Well, for whom?
Right.
We documented that recovery for Katrina took at least 10 years, and so much is baked into the system. And we're going to continue to have income and wealth differences.
Mm.
We're going to continue to have sexism, racism, other isms in our system, both at the social, psychological, individual level, and at macro levels where it's built into the system, or for some people, they don't even recognize it. I don't know if this is the case now, but I remember one of Brenda's graduate students was like 20 over 20 years ago now, was working on household recovery, and she was able to gain access to the data. I think I'm getting this right, from the teleregistration center, although it was highly scrubbed teleregistration center. Um, but basically, we found the FEMA system for housing was that if you owned a house, lots of resources available. Now, if you were a homeowner, it might not feel that way, but there was stuff there for you to get back into the home you owned and try to get back to normal life. If you were a renter, quite simply, you're screwed. The resources weren't there. So, at that time, that was baked into the system.
Mhm.
Now, whether something similar like that exists today, but I'd be willing to bet if you're a homeowner, today you can get through the system better than if you were a renter. So I think vulnerability is something that's always lingering there. We have to consider it. It's baked into the system. And it also has that relationship with time. And
Right.
it's just not going to happen as fast.
I agree with you that to me, vulnerability is a term which also you can work with in terms of deep time and historical change over long
Oh,
stretches of time and help you understand structures like the healthcare system in the United States. Whereas resilience, to me, I know why people jumped at resilience, and I don't want to litigate resilience here. I think, but it's resilience to me is allergic to time analysis.
mm,
It's very much it's very focused on the near past, the present, and some sort of future, and a set of conditions. And it puts so much pressure on the individual and doesn't look at structures as much as I would like it to. And that's my beef. But as you said, and I like the way you said this, I think as educators and as researchers, we got to use every tool. So maybe the resilience tool doesn't work for you right now, but that doesn't mean we have to go on a crusade. And I'm lecturing against myself here. I'm going to crusade against resilience or a crusade against these other terms. Use what you can. But I like you. I think the vulnerability points to factors of time and to structure that ultimately are important. And I guess it also what I hear you saying too is that in the career of a disaster researcher, you kind of got to be in it for the long game. It's not going to be one disaster that's going to change the whole political economy, nor is it going to make or break your whole career. You got to be thinking over long stretches of time as a researcher. And that's important, I think, advice. You didn't you're not preaching, but I want to extract from what you said and think to younger researchers who are entering the field. I draw a lot of optimism from that point, Dave.
yeah, yeah. And I would hope that these newer generations do take the time to dig back into the classic works, because only then will some of the other stuff they're reading now, really make sense. Uh, and even if someone were to look at my work, there's a lot of either intentionally or unintentionally subtle stuff in there that even if it's not directly cited, you can see the influence of Dines and Quarantelli or Draybeck or Gilbert White for that fact. And
Mm,
it just it took. See, Gilbert wrote in 1934 that humans create disasters such as floods. Yeah, but it really wasn't until the 92 or 93 Mississippi River floods was that point really proven. Now, there was evidence before, but gosh, that's a long time for a prediction to come true because Mother Nature moves at a different clock than we do. Just like pandemics, 100 years since our last pandemic.
right. Well, I want to give a shout out to a lot of what we've just been discussing. You go into greater detail in several articles, but one particularly reconsidering the phases of disaster, which you published in the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters, came in '97. And for a disaster research nerd like me, it took me back to the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters database, and all this is open source, so everybody can go and read those. And I get lost in there
Yeah,
in a good way. I mean, it's like there's so much great work in there. And then the Disaster Research Center, I want to give a shout out to Valerie Marlowe and what she's doing at the Disaster Research Center archive, because they have a tremendous database where you can read working papers, things that were published, things that are unpublished, and things that are in the works. And some of that is your work and the colleagues that you pointed to. I've been very greedy with your time, and in fact, I got so into the conversation I didn't even remind people what we were doing here. So this is COVID Calls, and you're listening to my conversation with Dave NEAL, disaster research and emergency management scholar, and this is the 350th episode of COVID Calls, and I can't think of a better way to have spent it than talking to you, Dave. I want to have one more question and then a chance for you to underline anything that you think we didn't touch on that you want to hit. But I do want to, I'm cautious about this, but I want to talk about Trump. Or I guess more generally, I want to talk about authoritarianism charismatic people and conspiracy, and I think it's sort of all wrapped up in there when I think about Trump, because I've heard this a bit, and I wonder what you think. Yes, COVID was a unique challenge in a hundred ways, and it showed why you need to also leave space for improvisation and for people, charismatic people, to step up and cut through what can be too slow processes. And I'm temperamentally inclined towards that idea. And
Yeah.
then yet when I look at it and I see, okay, but in this case, it was Donald Trump that was doing that. That he made this this is my pen. Only I can solve this. I will create the vaccine program. I will tell you what the numbers mean. And so I think it showed to me, and I want to hear what you think about this. I could be off base, but he showed, yes, the need and the prospect for having an individual translate the complexity of a disaster to the public. But to my mind, he showed, when there's no guardrails on that, what happens when an authoritarian does that. And it's bad.
Yeah, in my view, the initial managing of COVID was not good, and basically, and here I'm going to use the research to sort of back up what I say, is we know so much about. In my day, it was called warning. Now it's called the risk communication, whatever. We know how to send out these messages. We know how to do it effectively. We know how to do it and make it work. And one of the things we also know is, for God's sake, don't send out mixed messages. And we were certainly at first getting mixed messages. And here I go into speculation, but with Bannon, I don't know if he was in Trump's ear at this time, but Bannon's whole philosophy of just stirring things up, drawing from Lenin of all people, but stirring things up, and the way that Trump liked to operate was to stir things up and then politicizing both mask wearing and the vaccination. That's why we are where we are today. And almost 700,000 people in a year and a half have lost their lives here in the United States because of those antics. And then to find people with medical degrees who would go along with this nonsense. And it's just, it's hard to fight. It really is. I mean, it was hard enough to fight rumors and misinformation before the internet, before Facebook and Twitter. And now it's even worse. I remember Bill Clinton and his political team when he was running for election. They had an emergency response team where if something came up, boom, they could attack it right away. Well, that was 1992. I don't know if that approach would work today. The issue of an authoritarian personality in the United States has always worried me. I was concerned during Watergate. Those were tough times. But this, and politicizing the vaccine and politicizing COVID, had just made it a lot worse. And interestingly, that 33%, they seem to forget that Trump got vaccinated. Everyone at Fox News has to be vaccinated. Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News, was one of the very first people, period, to get vaccinated. But they're using these. Well, Tucker Carlson, he's vaccinated. I mean, just someone did a good job of just throwing a monkey wrench into the system. And that'll be for future social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, historians to try to figure out. But all those lessons are there. Mm-hmm. People have already been drawing parallels between 1930 Germany and us right now.
That's disconcerting. Well, we should get towards wrapping up. Sure. Anything left on the table that you wanted to mention that we didn't get to? I know we could do another session, and maybe we should, but
I'd be glad to down the road, and hopefully we would be out of all of this by then. Um, for me, it's just been an interesting 40 years watching, I'll say, the fields develop, the disaster management and the emergency manage of the profession and the research develop. We're moving forward. There's been a lot of mistakes made. Maybe that's part for another time, where the academy and FEMA made some poor decisions on what we're doing. Sometimes they were trying to do the right thing. Other times, I'll just say this: the degree programs are seen as a profit center rather than trying to push along uh, good. Um, I'm going to be sitting back watching. I might have one or two things. I've got some papers to finish up, but maybe one or two new things before I eventually hang up my computer. I guess that's metaphor instead of cleats or whatever. But we're in tough times right now. We, we really are. And I keep on trying to draw parallels between this and if we were in England during World War II being bombed by both bombers and then the V-1 and V-2 rockets, just this constant parade of crises. How long can we hang in there to do this and maintain our somewhat normal lives? And with that, any the researchers out there, think about time and disaster. A lot of things are wrapped up in it. I also have a publication from an International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters simply called Social Time and Disaster,
Mhm.
published 2013, I think. And it goes into a lot more. It's like the continuation piece of the four phases. If you really want to get your hands dirty, and I think at least implicitly see some of the issues between time and vulnerability. That's a
Mhm.
that's a good one to read. So with that, I'm we'll call it a night. I really
Yeah.
thank you, Scott, for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun, and let's do it again sometime. Maybe number 700. I hope.
Yeah. Oh man. I yeah, I said I would stop at 100 and that was a while ago and here we go. But I really it would be thank you for mentioning that 2013 piece, Dave. And I'd love to see you put all those essays together into a short book. I think that would be well, that's a conversation for another day. But and I agree with you that sort of thinking about time and disaster is really crucial. Just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, episode 350, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live, 6 p.m. Eastern Time weekdays. Today was a special one at 7:30 p.m. and special thanks to my guest, the great Dave NEAL. Always learned a lot from your work and have enjoyed this opportunity and hope to get to see you in person sometime. Stay healthy, Dave, and everybody else stay healthy. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls. Thanks.
Bye bye.